In the stillness of the desert night, beneath a sky embroidered with 1,000 stars, a story began. One not merely etched into the annals of history, but woven into the very soul of humanity. It is the story of a man whose life would become a mirror for all who seek truth, mercy, and meaning. A man chosen by the Creator, not because of wealth, lineage, or power, but because of the purity of his heart and the clarity of his spirit. A man who walked gently upon the earth, yet whose message would thunder across time and continents. This is the story of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, the seal of all prophets, the mercy sent to the worlds, and the guiding light through the darkness of ignorance. Long before his name echoed in prayer, before his words softened, hearts hardened by arrogance, before his eyes welled with tears for the suffering of others, the world awaited his arrival. It awaited a man who would bring light where there was shadow, dignity where there was oppression, and love where there was cruelty. Arabia in the 6th century was a land of fractured tribes and misguided customs, where idols filled the sacred sanctuary of the Kaaba and might often eclipse what was right. Honor was rooted in lineage, loyalty in blood, and truth was buried under the sands of superstition. Yet within this very landscape of confusion and moral collapse, Allah chose to raise a man who would become a living example of the Quran, a man whose every action would reflect divine wisdom, whose silence would speak volumes, and whose life would heal what was broken. He was born an orphan, wrapped not in royal cloth but in simplicity and sorrow. From the very beginning, he tasted loss, the absence of a father he never knew, the warmth of a mother that faded too soon, the care of a grandfather that slipped through his young fingers. Yet from these early wounds, compassion bloomed. The ache of being alone taught him to embrace others. The sting of hardship cultivated within him the strength to carry the burdens of an entire ummah. And the silence of his youth, those long moments spent watching the stars, walking through the hills of Mecca, and listening to the wind whisper through the desert, nurtured a heart attuned not to the noise of the world, but to the voice of the divine. He did not seek greatness, but greatness found him. He did not raise his voice in anger, yet his words could awaken sleeping souls. Those who met him, even for a moment, never forgot the serenity of his presence or the depth of his gaze. He was known simply as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, an honor earned not through ambition, but through the quiet, consistent rhythm of honesty and integrity. And when the heavens opened, and the angel Jibreel came bearing revelation, the one who had lived in silence became the one who would deliver the most eloquent message ever heard, the final word of Allah to mankind. Yet, his story is not only one of prophetic mission, it is a story of the human spirit at its most beautiful, of a man who cried in the depths of the night for people who would never meet him, of a soul who forgave when he could have condemned, who chose patience when he could have fought, who embraced those who once rejected him. He was the leader who slept on straw mats, the conqueror who entered his city bowed in humility, the husband who mended his own clothes, the friend who never broke a promise, the teacher who listened more than he spoke, and above all, he was the servant of Allah, utterly devoted, completely surrendered, and filled with a love for his Lord that shaped every breath he took. To follow his story is to walk a path of reflection, to feel the stirring of something sacred deep within the chest. It is to see that truth can still shine in the darkest places, that mercy can still bloom where hatred once ruled, and that the most profound change can begin with a single heart illuminated by faith. His journey is not just history, it is healing. Not just biography, it is a mirror. And not just for Muslims, but for all of humanity, for any who seek the eternal light that still radiates from his life. This is the story of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The story of a man who was light in every sense of the word. In the sacred city of Mecca, nestled among sun-drenched hills and beneath a sky that bore witness to centuries of caravans and prayers, a child was born who would one day awaken the soul of a slumbering world. It was the year of the elephant, a year marked by divine intervention, when an invading army led by Abraham sought to destroy the Kaaba. only to be halted by a miraculous shower of stones sent from flocks of birds above. That celestial event echoed through the hearts of the people, a sign that something extraordinary was on the horizon. And within that same year, as if the earth itself was exhaling in relief after such deliverance, a boy was born into the noble clan of Banu Hashim. His name was Muhammad, meaning the praised one. But in the quiet of his infancy, he was just a child without a father, yet held by the gaze of heaven. Even before he opened his eyes to the world, sorrow visited his cradle. His father, Abdullah, had passed away while on a trading journey, leaving Amina, his gentle and pious mother, to cradle the weight of both grief and new life. She held her son with the fierce tenderness of a mother who knew her child was different, though she could not yet name why. In those first nights, as the desert wind rustled the palms and the moon traced its silver arc over the still dunes, Amina would look into the eyes of her infant son and feel something stir within her heart, something sacred, as if this tiny being already carried with him an ancient promise. To give him the strength of the desert and the purity of its tongue, Muhammad was entrusted, as was the tradition of the time, to a Bedouin wet nurse. And so he was taken into the arid heart of Arabia to live among the nomads who understood the land like a sacred text. In the arms of Halima Sadiya, his foster mother, blessings began to pour like rain upon dry soil. Her household, once struggling with scarcity, found its fortunes miraculously changed. Her flocks grew strong, her animals produced milk in abundance, and her heart grew ever more attached to the quiet, radiant child who seemed to bring with him a peace that softened the very air. The desert became his first classroom, where he learned the language of silence, the discipline of stillness, and the beauty of simplicity. There was a gentleness in his nature, even as a boy, that set him apart. He would wander the open plains, gazing at the stars, watching the movements of animals, and listening to the wind as though it whispered secrets meant only for him. He was quiet, never boastful, but those around him noticed something unusual, an inner light, an awareness, a serenity that did not belong to one so young. When Halima finally returned him to Amina, her heart broke to part from him, for she had come to feel that the boy she raised was destined for a greatness beyond her understanding. For a few brief years, he was wrapped in the love of his mother. Amina, though widowed, poured into her son all the care and tenderness she could offer. But destiny, always moving according to the divine plan, had more trials prepared for this child of light. When he was just 6 years old, Amina set out on a journey to Yathrib, today known as Medina, to visit the resting place of her late husband. It was a pilgrimage of memory, and she took Muhammad with her. But on their return to Mecca, tragedy struck once more. Amina fell gravely ill, and in the quiet village of Abwa, her soul departed from this world. Her final moments were spent cradling her son, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and love, whispering whatever final prayers a mother can summon before leaving her child behind. Orphaned once more, now without the gentle hand of either parent, Muhammad was entrusted to the care of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, a respected elder of the Quraysh. Abdul Muttalib loved the boy with a special affection. He saw in him a calm dignity, a quiet wisdom that did not fit his tender age. He would seat him beside him during gatherings of tribal leaders, allow him to speak, and listen to him with a respect not given lightly. Yet even this brief season of comfort would not last. Only 2 years later, Abdul Muttalib too passed away, leaving young Muhammad in the care of his uncle, Abu Talib. Loss had followed him like a shadow through his early years, yet it never hardened his heart. Instead, it deepened it. Each sorrow carved a space within him that would later be filled with mercy for others. He knew the pain of loneliness, the ache of absence, the quiet tears of longing. And from that personal valley of hardship emerged a boy whose spirit was not broken, but refined. Abu Talib, though not wealthy, loved his nephew dearly and raised him as one of his own. He clothed him, fed him, and took him on trading journeys across the desert. Under Abu Talib's roof, Muhammad began to see the wider world, to witness the inequalities among people, the cruelty of the powerful, and the suffering of those without means or protection. But even then, his response was not of anger or bitterness. He observed, he listened, and he quietly resolved to be a person of integrity in a world that often rewarded deceit. And so, within the backdrop of sweeping dunes and star-filled skies, Muhammad's childhood unfolded. Not in comfort, but in quiet preparation. Every loss was a lesson, every trial a refining fire. Though his story began with abandonment, it blossomed into a life of unshakable trust in the one who never abandons. Even before revelation touched his heart, Muhammad had been shaped by the divine hand, molded by love and sorrow into a soul capable of carrying the heaviest of burdens. The final message to humanity. These early chapters of his life are more than biography. They are sacred echoes. They remind us that hardship is never without purpose, that loss can create space for divine mercy, and that the ones who seem most forgotten by the world may be the very ones chosen to transform it. Such was the path of the boy from Mecca, the orphan who would one day change the world, not by force, but by faith. After the passing of his beloved mother, Amina, the world must have felt vast and silent to the young Muhammad, as if the earth itself had exhaled a breath of sorrow on his behalf. He was only 6 years old when he watched her eyes close for the final time in the small village of Abwa. The embrace that once carried him through the nights was gone. And yet, even in this moment of profound loneliness, the boy was not truly alone. The unseen hand of Allah was guiding every step, gently preparing his heart for a life that would one day carry the weight of an entire ummah. Though the world had taken both mother and father from him, it could not take the divine purpose that nestled quietly within his soul. He returned to Mecca in the arms of a servant, a silent journey of grief and quiet acceptance. Awaiting him in the holy city was his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, a man of honor and wisdom, known and respected throughout the Quraysh tribe. Upon seeing the orphan child of his lost son Abdullah, Abdul Muttalib's heart softened. He took the boy into his care with an affection that was deep and immediate, as though he recognized that this child, this gentle, soft-spoken child, was destined for something far beyond the reach of ordinary men. Abdul Muttalib was no stranger to the sacred. He had once been the one who, by divine guidance, rediscovered the long-lost well of Zamzam. He understood that there are moments when heaven quietly places its mark upon the earth, and in his grandson, he sensed a light that needed only time to rise. Despite his age, Abdul Muttalib made every effort to ensure the boy felt secure and cherished. He would seat Muhammad beside him under the shade of the Kaaba's sacred walls while tribal leaders gathered in discussion. Though others saw only a child, Abdul Muttalib treated him as someone worthy of honor and voice. He let the boy sit in places where no child had sat before, and if someone tried to move him, Abdul Muttalib would stop them, saying, "Leave him. By Allah, this boy will hold a great rank." There was something profoundly still about young Muhammad. His presence carried a tranquility that drew people in, though he never sought attention. He watched more than he spoke. He listened with a heart wide open, as if every sound in the world was a clue to a higher truth. He was not a boy of idle games or reckless pursuits. Instead, he walked with quiet purpose, a soul shaped by early loss, yet anchored in a trust that what was taken had not been lost in vain. But time, like the wind over the dunes, never lingers long in one place. Just 2 years after his mother's passing, another shadow fell across the boy's heart. Abdul Muttalib, now aged and worn, returned to his Lord. With him, the warmth of grandfatherly protection faded, and once more Muhammad stood at the edge of loss. He was only 8 years old, yet life had already asked him to say farewell to every hand that had held him with love. And still, he did not become bitter. Instead, with each sorrow, his heart deepened, its soil quietly watered by tears that the world rarely saw. Upon Abdul Muttalib's death, the mantle of care passed to Abu Talib, the Prophet's paternal uncle. Though Abu Talib was not a man of great wealth, his heart was rich with loyalty, and his love for his nephew ran deeper than words. He took Muhammad into his home as one of his own, providing him with not just shelter, but something far more essential: devotion. He clothed him, fed him, and stood by him in every season of life. Through Abu Talib, Muhammad began to learn not only the ways of trade and travel, but the nuances of tribal leadership, responsibility, and patience. Traveling alongside his uncle in caravans through the desert, Muhammad encountered the broader world, its colors, its conflicts, its customs, and its contradictions. He observed the market stalls, listened to the haggling of traders, and watched how power shifted between the truthful and the corrupt. Though still a boy, his spirit absorbed these lessons with an awareness far beyond his years. He learned how injustice dressed itself in wealth, how arrogance often paraded as strength, and how those with the softest hearts often bore the heaviest burdens. It was in these travels that his compassion blossomed, not as a vague emotion, but as a practice of living, offering help, speaking truth, and never forgetting the pain of those the world chooses not to see. Muhammad would help with the family's modest needs, taking on responsibilities with a quiet grace. He never shirked a duty, never complained of hardship, and never carried resentment. There was a humility to his every act, and a calm that seemed to radiate from within. People began to notice, not just his honesty, but the way he made others feel. He was trustworthy in a society that often praised cunning. He was kind, in a world that admired toughness. And though he still bore the name of an orphan, he lived with the dignity of one beloved by heaven. In the arms of Abu Talib's family, Muhammad grew into adolescence with a heart rooted in patience, gratitude, and reflection. The echoes of his parents' absence did not fade, but rather became part of his inner landscape, a quiet ache that made him tender to the pain of others. He knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be left behind, and so he vowed silently that no one around him would ever feel forgotten in his presence. Years later, when the weight of prophethood would descend upon his shoulders, it was this early soil, tilled by loss, watered by love, and warmed by the quiet care of his grandfather and uncle, that allowed his mission to flourish. He had not been raised in palaces, nor trained in the courts of kings. Instead, he was raised among the ordinary, the struggling, the faithful. And from that upbringing, Allah formed an extraordinary soul. Even as a young man, the marks of the divine plan were visible for those who looked closely. Muhammad was orphaned in body, but never in spirit. He lost those who cradled him, but he was always cradled by the mercy of Allah. Through every chapter of his youth, a higher wisdom was unfolding. Each trial, each embrace, each farewell was a note in the symphony of a life chosen to carry light into a darkened world. Though the boy had lost many hands, he had never lost the guidance of the one who would never leave him. He was orphaned, but never alone. As the years unfolded and the sun of Mecca continued to rise and fall upon the ancient sands, the orphaned child, who once walked its narrow streets in quiet reflection, began to blossom into a young man of remarkable character. There was no trumpet to announce his growth, no public acclaim to mark the seasons of his life. Yet those who watched him knew that something profound dwelled within him. The city may have seen him as the son of Abdullah, the nephew of Abu Talib, but Allah saw him as the one whose soul would one day carry the final revelation to mankind. Even before the first word of the Quran descended, his life was a living verse, one of truth, compassion, and divine grace. Muhammad grew in the embrace of Mecca's hills and valleys, not as a seeker of wealth or status, but as a seeker of meaning. While other young men were drawn to revelry and tribal games, he remained distant from distractions. He was not aloof or arrogant, but rather enveloped in a quiet dignity that made people pause. His silence was not empty, but full. His eyes, often lowered in humility, spoke volumes. There was a gentleness in his voice, a sincerity in his smile, and a calmness in his presence that softened even the harshest of hearts. His companions would often say that once you met Muhammad, you never forgot him. In a society built on lineage, he stood out not because of his bloodline, though he came from a noble house, but because of the purity of his conduct. Mecca was a city of trade and politics, of shifting alliances and hidden ambitions. Honesty was rare, and trust was fragile. Yet in the heart of this complex society, Muhammad's word was enough to seal a deal, his presence enough to end a quarrel. He never cheated in trade, never exaggerated the value of his goods, never sought to deceive a buyer. He dealt with fairness that was startling, almost unbelievable, in a time when deceit was praised as cleverness. And slowly, with each transaction, each truthful word, each act of kindness, his reputation grew. The people began to call him Al-Amin, the trustworthy, not as a formal title bestowed by any council, but as a name spoken with sincerity from the lips of merchants, elders, and common folk. It was not merely what he did, but who he was. You could trust him with your wealth, your secrets, your children. You could trust that he would not speak falsely, even if it cost him a profit. You could trust that in a room full of self-interest, he would be the one seeking justice. This trust was his foundation, and it would later become the soil from which the message of Islam would bloom. His honesty was not reserved only for the marketplace. In every dimension of his life, he lived as though Allah was watching, and indeed he believed it so even before revelation. He respected the rights of others, cared for the poor, and treated the weak with kindness. He would stop to greet a child with the same attention he gave to a tribal elder. He would visit the sick, comfort the bereaved, and defend the oppressed. His hands were never raised in arrogance, his tongue never used to humiliate. There was strength in his restraint, power in his patience. When disputes arose among the tribes of Mecca, it was Muhammad whom they called to mediate. His judgment was sound, his wisdom uncommon for one so young. One moment stands out like a gleaming star in the night sky, a moment that would etch his name deeper into the hearts of his people. During the renovation of the Kaaba, the sacred sanctuary, the tribal leaders quarreled over who would have the honor of placing the black stone in its rightful place. Tempers flared, swords were nearly drawn, and it seemed blood would be spilled within sight of the house of God. But then someone spoke. Let us ask Al-Amin. Let Muhammad decide. And so they brought him, not as a man of power, but as a man of peace. He listened carefully, his eyes steady and thoughtful. Then, in his quiet brilliance, he proposed a solution that honored every tribe. He laid the black stone on a cloth and invited a leader from each tribe to hold a corner. Together, they lifted it, and Muhammad placed the stone with his own blessed hands. What could have ended in bloodshed was resolved with unity. This was not only an act of wisdom, it was a moment of divine preparation, a sign to the people that the one among them who brought peace to their worldly affairs would soon bring peace to their souls. Even as he earned their respect, Muhammad remained humble. He never sought leadership, never raised himself above others, never claimed moral superiority. He would walk alongside the poor, eat with the hungry, and wear simple garments without complaint. He lived not for status, but for sincerity. And though his heart was full of compassion, it was also restless. He looked at the world around him and saw things that wounded his spirit. Idols worshipped in every corner, the cries of the oppressed silenced by the noise of power, women treated as objects, orphans forgotten, truth twisted for the benefit of the few. These things did not sit quietly in his soul. They stirred something within him, a yearning for justice, for light, for truth. He began to seek solitude. Sometimes he would climb the mountains surrounding Mecca and sit in silence, letting the wind carry his prayers to the unseen. The Cave of Hira became his retreat, a place where he could think, reflect, and cry to the heavens in search of meaning. His heart was full of questions, not doubts. He believed in something greater, though he had not yet seen its full form. And in that space, between revelation and silence, between trust and mystery, Allah was preparing his messenger. This chapter of his life, before the Quran, before the angels, before the world knew his name as a prophet, is no less sacred. It is a testimony that character is revelation in its own right, that even before the divine message was spoken through his tongue, it was visible in his actions. Long before the verses were etched into pages, the truth was written across his life. He was Al-Amin of Mecca, the man who never betrayed a trust, the youth who chose dignity over desire, the merchant who never lied, the neighbor who never turned away, the heart that beat with mercy even before the command to give it was revealed. And it is in this early life of honesty, patience, and silent submission that we see the first light of prophecy, not in miracles or sermons, but in the way he lived when no one was watching, when there was no audience but the angels, and the only applause was the quiet approval of the Lord of the worlds. In the heart of Mecca, where the sun's golden rays touched the stone pathways and the scent of frankincense floated through the air, two lives were quietly being prepared for a union that would shape the course of history. One was a man whose honesty and gentleness had already become a beacon in a society clouded by arrogance and greed. The other was a woman of noble lineage, deep intelligence, and unwavering grace. She had lived through life's joys and losses, had known love and grief, and yet within her heart burned a strength that only a few could perceive. Her name was Khadijah. May Allah be pleased with her. And the man whose character would captivate her heart was Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. She had heard of him before their paths crossed, not from grand stories or exaggerated praises, but from whispers of truth passed through merchants, travelers, and common folk alike. They spoke of a young man whose dealings were always just, whose words were never tainted by falsehood, and whose presence radiated trust. In a city where deception was a skill and ambition often led men astray, Muhammad's reputation shone like a rare gem. He had earned the name Al-Amin, and it echoed in the hearts of those who longed for something real, something pure. Khadijah was a woman of both wealth and wisdom, a successful businesswoman in a world where few women held such power. She was known not only for her enterprise, but for her generosity, dignity, and insight. She managed caravans, dealt with traders, and navigated the complexities of commerce with an elegance that won the respect of Mecca's most powerful men. Yet behind the strength of her public life lay a soul that yearned for something deeper than material success. She longed for sincerity, for peace, for companionship rooted in faith and honor. It was through her business that their lives would intertwine. Khadijah, having heard of Muhammad's unwavering honesty, sought his help in managing one of her trade caravans to Syria. She offered him a position, entrusting him with goods and the oversight of a major journey, an offer he accepted with humility and dedication. Alongside him on this expedition was her loyal servant, Maysara, who would later return not just with reports of a successful venture, but with stories that would leave Khadijah quietly awestruck. He spoke of Muhammad's fairness in trade, his kindness to strangers, his calm temperament, and his refusal to exploit anyone for gain. He described how the man never lost his composure, never raised his voice, and always treated those around him with dignity. It was not just the outcome of the trade that impressed Maysara, it was the presence of the man himself. As Khadijah listened to these accounts, something stirred within her heart. It was not infatuation, nor mere admiration. It was something far more profound. It was the awakening of a recognition that this man's soul mirrored her own. He had not sought her favor, had not tried to charm her or prove his worth. His worth was self-evident, flowing not from his words, but from his actions. And in the stillness of her thoughts, she began to see that this man, humble and sincere, might be the answer to the longing she had quietly carried for years. Though she was older in age and held a status few women possessed, it was she who took the first step. She sent a proposal of marriage to Muhammad through a trusted friend. It was a gesture not of dominance, but of sincerity and courage. When the proposal reached him, Muhammad was deeply moved. He had never been one to seek worldly gain or recognition, and here was a woman of high standing and remarkable character expressing a desire to walk beside him. He turned to his uncle, Abu Talib, for counsel, and with his blessing, Muhammad accepted the proposal. Their marriage was not marked by extravagance or display. There was no need for such things, for what passed between them was richer than gold and deeper than ceremony. It was a sacred bond, founded on mutual respect, compassion, and truth. From the moment they joined their lives, their home became a sanctuary, not just from the noise of the world, but from its illusions. In Khadijah, Muhammad found peace, a refuge where he could rest his weary soul. In Muhammad, Khadijah found a partner who never demanded, never belittled, and never withheld affection. He was present, not just in body, but in heart. Together they built a home rooted in simplicity and filled with light. Their love was not loud, but it was profound. It was the kind of love that shows itself in small, enduring gestures, a glance that speaks volumes, a shared silence that comforts, a hand offered in support when words are not enough. Khadijah never questioned his quiet retreats into reflection, never doubted the depth of his thoughts. She supported him without hesitation, even when his heart grew restless with questions about the world and its injustices. Years passed in harmony. Children were born to them, each one a thread weaving them closer together. And though they faced the trials of parenthood, the demands of business, and the shifting tensions of Meccan society, their love remained unshaken. She was the first to hear his fears, the first to celebrate his joys, and the first to witness the sacred stirrings of a divine calling. When the first revelation descended upon Muhammad in the Cave of Hira, and the angel's words left him trembling in awe and fear, it was to Khadijah that he ran. His voice, unsteady, cried out, "Cover me, cover me." And without a word, she wrapped him in her cloak, held him to her heart, and waited for his fear to pass. When he told her what had occurred, she did not falter. She did not question. Instead, she looked into his eyes and said with the conviction of a soul that knew its beloved, "By Allah, he will never disgrace you. You uphold ties of kinship, you speak the truth. You bear the burden of the weak. You earn for the needy, you honor your guest, and you assist those who are afflicted with calamities." In those words, Khadijah became the first believer, the first to affirm that what had come to her husband was from the heavens. She took him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, a man learned in the scriptures, who confirmed that the angel who visited Muhammad was the same who had come to the prophets before him. And from that moment on, Khadijah's role was not only that of a wife, but of a spiritual companion, the one who stood at his side through rejection, hardship, and the heavy burden of revelation. Her support was unwavering. When the people of Mecca turned away, she remained. When the mockery grew louder, her silence was filled with strength. When the night stretched long and his prayers deepened into tears, she was the one who dried them. Her wealth was used to support the early believers, her home became a center of solace, and her presence a balm for every wound the world inflicted upon him. When she passed away, the prophet never stopped honoring her. Even years later, he would speak of her with tears in his eyes. He would send gifts to her friends, remember her voice, and say, "She believed in me when no one else did. She accepted Islam when people rejected me, and she supported me with her wealth when there was no one else." Their marriage was not ordinary, it was sacred. It was a light in the early days of Islam that gave warmth and strength to the one who would carry the final message. In her arms, he found peace. In his presence, she found purpose. And together, they built the foundation of a faith that would change the world. Their love was not just a love between man and woman. It was a love woven with divine purpose, one that still whispers to hearts today the beauty of trust, partnership, and unwavering devotion. There are moments in history when time itself seems to pause, holding its breath as something sacred prepares to unfold. The world may move on in its rhythm, its noise, its distractions, its endless pursuit of the material. But somewhere, often in silence and solitude, the heavens descend upon a heart that has been prepared by years of reflection, pain, compassion, and deep yearning. Such was the state of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, when he began retreating to a cave nestled in the mountains just outside Mecca. It was not an escape from life, but a quiet pursuit of meaning beyond it, a longing to understand the suffering around him, the corruption that had taken root in society, and the aching truth he could feel but not yet name. The Cave of Hira stood in stillness on the slopes of Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light, its narrow opening facing the Kaaba far below. It was a humble place. No bed, no light, no comfort, but the embrace of solitude and the whispering wind that carried with it echoes of the eternal. And it was here, in this silent chamber, that Muhammad began to spend his days and nights, seeking not wealth, not recognition, but answers. He would bring with him some food and water, leaving behind the bustling world of Mecca with its clamor of markets, idols, and injustice, and climb the rocky path alone, his heart heavy with questions too vast for words. Each night in the cave was wrapped in stillness, save for the rustle of the desert wind and the breath of a man who whispered prayers to the unseen. The stars above him glittered like verses waiting to be revealed, and the silence became a friend. In that solitude, he did not seek dreams of grandeur, nor visions of angels. He sought his Lord, the one he felt in the depths of his soul, though he had not yet heard his name through revelation. He pondered creation, the moon that waxed and waned, the sun that rose with mercy, the night that offered rest, and the human soul that carried so much beauty yet caused so much pain. He reflected on the suffering of the poor, the burial of infant daughters, the tyranny of the powerful, and the emptiness of stone idols who could neither hear nor speak. He searched for truth the way a thirsty man searches for water in the desert, patiently, but with desperation. And while the world below went on unaware, something unseen was stirring. The heavens watched, the angels listened, and the decree of the Almighty neared its time. One night, on a night known only to Allah, destined to mark the dawn of the final message, everything changed. The darkness inside the cave was broken not by fire nor lamp, but by a presence. Suddenly, Muhammad was enveloped by a radiance that was not of this world. A being stood before him, majestic, powerful, and awe-inspiring. It was Jibril, the Archangel Gabriel, the same messenger who had come to the prophets before him. But for Muhammad, this was his first encounter with the celestial. His heart pounded with terror, his limbs trembled, and his soul, so used to stillness, now stood face to face with a reality too immense for words. Jibril did not greet him with a smile or a title. Instead, he issued a command. A single word, sharp and echoing through the cave. Iqra, read. The command struck Muhammad with confusion. He had never read, never learned the letters that others studied. I am not a reader, he replied, his voice trembling. But again the angel repeated, Iqra. Again Muhammad responded, I am not a reader. Then a third time, the angel spoke. Not just a command, but the beginning of divine revelation. Read, in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. These words entered not just his ears, but his soul. They carried a weight that no ordinary sentence could bear. They were alive, infused with the power of the Almighty, and they settled into his heart like seeds, destined to blossom into a forest of truth. It was as though the entire universe had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the seal of prophethood would be pressed upon the final messenger, and the eternal guidance of humanity would begin its descent. But the moment overwhelmed him. The cave, once his sanctuary, had become the gateway between heaven and earth. His body, unprepared for such divine contact, shook with fear. His heart raced, his breath quickened, and so he fled. Down the rocky path he ran, his feet unsure, his heart pounding with a fear that was not of this world. He did not yet fully understand what had happened, but he knew something extraordinary, something beyond anything he had ever experienced, had taken place. He returned home, to the only place where his soul could find rest, to Khadijah, his beloved wife. He entered their home pale and trembling, his voice shaking as he called out, "Cover me! Cover me!" And she did, without question, without panic. She wrapped him in a cloak and held him close, her own heart steady as the mountain itself. She did not demand answers. She offered comfort. She let silence settle until he was ready to speak. And when he finally found his voice, he told her everything. Every word, every feeling, every fear. And when he finished, she did not doubt. She did not suggest madness or illusion. She, with her wisdom and faith, simply said, "By Allah, he will never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your kin, you speak the truth, you help the poor and the destitute, you serve your guests generously, and you assist those in need." In those words, she gave him what only true love can offer: belief before proof, support before understanding, faith before certainty. But her support did not end with words. She took him to someone who could help make sense of what had occurred. Her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, an elderly Christian who had studied the scriptures of the past, listened intently. And when Muhammad finished his account, Waraka's eyes filled with awe. "This is the same one who came to Moses," he declared. "You have been chosen as a prophet. Your people will oppose you, but if I am alive on that day, I will support you with all my strength." The night of revelation was not a spectacle witnessed by thousands. There were no crowds, no torches, no processions, just a man in a cave, a message from the heavens, and a heart chosen to carry it. But in that quiet night, the world shifted. A light had descended that would never be extinguished. And though the path ahead would be filled with hardship, mockery, and resistance, the first words had been spoken. The journey had begun. The Cave of Hira became sacred not because of its walls, but because of what it witnessed. It witnessed a trembling heart that said yes to the call of the divine. It witnessed the moment when heaven kissed the earth. And from that moment forward, the man who once climbed the mountain in search of truth would now descend it as the bearer of truth, the messenger of Allah to all of mankind. Peace and blessings be upon him, the one who received the first revelation, not in glory, but in awe, not in power, but in surrender. And from that surrender, the final message was born. In the sacred quiet after the first revelation, the world seemed both transformed and untouched. The streets of Mecca bustled as they always had. The merchants haggled over spices and silk, and idols stood stoically in the Kaaba, unmoved by the divine words that had descended from above. Yet within the heart of one man, the universe had shifted entirely. Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, now carried a trust unlike any other, a message not born of this world, a call from the Creator to guide humanity back to the path of truth. The revelation had not only stirred his soul, but called upon him to awaken the hearts of others. Still, the command to spread this message did not begin with a cry from the mountaintop. It began in whispers, in moments of deep connection, in the sacred shelter of trust and love. After that first night in the cave, the prophet did not rush to the public square. He waited. He reflected. Revelation would continue to come, gently shaping him, comforting his heart, assuring him that he was not mad, not alone. These early days of prophecy were intimate, filled with contemplation and patience. He was being prepared, carved inwardly by divine light, readied for the immense task ahead. But a messenger cannot carry truth without eventually sharing it. And so, quietly, the call began, not with mass gatherings, but with one heart at a time. The very first to believe in him, without hesitation or doubt, was his beloved wife, Khadijah. May Allah be pleased with her. Her faith was not rooted in seeing miracles or hearing angels. Her belief was born from knowing the man himself. She had seen his character in every moment, the way he helped the poor, honored the guest, protected the weak, and stood firmly for justice. So when he said that the Lord of the heavens had spoken to him, she did not ask for signs. Her heart already knew. In that moment, she became the first Muslim, the first soul to bow, not with her body, but with her heart, to the truth of Allah's message. And through her belief, the Prophet found strength, a light beside him that would never flicker so long as she lived. Not long after, another young soul entered the fold of faith. It was his cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, only a boy, but wise beyond his years. Ali had lived in the Prophet's household, observed him in ways that children do, seeing him when the world did not watch, watching how he treated people, how he prayed even before Islam, how he spoke and carried himself. When the Prophet confided in him about the message, Ali did not hesitate. Though young, his heart was pure, his mind unclouded by tribal pride or worldly ambition. He believed, not because others did, but because the truth made sense to him. He would later grow into one of Islam's greatest warriors and scholars. But in those early days, he was simply the boy whose heart opened to the light before it had even reached the horizon. Then came Zayd ibn Haritha, the Prophet's adopted son, who had once been a slave but was given freedom and love in the Prophet's home. Zayd had experienced society's cruelty, had felt what it meant to be unwanted, to be treated as property. Yet in Muhammad, he had found dignity. He had found a man who called him son, not servant. So when the Prophet told him about the revelations, Zayd's belief flowed effortlessly. He did not need persuasion. He had already seen the mercy and justice of this message in the life of the man who had rescued him from the shadows of society. And then there was Abu Bakr, beloved friend, loyal companion, a man of honor and deep insight. When the Prophet shared the message with him, Abu Bakr did not question, did not delay. His belief was immediate, like the recognition of something his soul had been waiting for all along. He was wealthy, influential, and well-respected in Mecca, yet his heart was humble and sincere. Abu Bakr did not keep the light to himself. He went out quietly and spoke to those he trusted, bringing others to the faith, people like Uthman ibn Affan, Talha ibn Ubaidullah, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, and Zubair ibn al-Awwam, names that would one day shine among the stars of the Ummah. But in these early days, they were simply believers whispering the truth in hushed tones behind closed doors. In those first 3 years, the Prophet did not call to Islam openly. The revelations came slowly, each verse weaving a tapestry of guidance, each moment refining the message and preparing the hearts of those who believed. They met in secret, gathering in the home of Al-Arqam ibn Abi Arqam, a young man whose house became a sanctuary of learning and prayer. It was a quiet fortress, hidden from the eyes of the Quraysh, where the new Muslims could hear the Quran recited and begin to understand their purpose. These gatherings were filled not with rituals or grand ceremonies, but with sincerity and awe. Every word of revelation felt like rain falling on parched earth. It healed, it awakened, it gave hope. The believers were few, but they were strong in spirit. They were not from a single tribe or class. Among them were the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the free and the enslaved. Bilal ibn Rabah, an Ethiopian slave, would soon join their ranks. He would feel the message deep in his chest and know that even a man without freedom in the eyes of society was cherished in the sight of Allah. Islam was already shattering the chains of inequality long before it had the power to do so publicly. The Prophet continued to teach with gentleness and wisdom. He did not impose. He invited. He listened to people's doubts, answered with compassion, and never forced a soul to believe. His mission, he knew, was to deliver the message, not to compel hearts, but to illuminate them. He lived what he preached, showing by example the mercy of Allah, the nobility of truth, and the justice of submission to the one Creator. These early believers were like seeds planted in the dark soil of an indifferent world. But even in darkness, seeds know how to grow. Their roots stretched quietly through the earth, and though few could see it yet, the tree of Islam had begun to rise. Its branches would one day touch every corner of the globe, but in those first days, it remained hidden, sheltered in secrecy, watered by the tears and prayers of a small group of faithful hearts. It was not fear that kept the prophet silent in those early years. It was wisdom. Allah had not yet commanded him to speak openly, and the timing of divine instruction is always perfect. These hidden years were not wasted. They were sacred. They allowed the foundation to be built slowly, deeply, and with sincerity. Every new believer was like a candle lit from the flame of prophecy, and with each light, the darkness retreated just a little more. In those whispers, in that secrecy, in that stillness, Islam grew. It grew in hearts, in homes, in quiet conversations beneath the stars. And when the time came for the message to be declared to the world, it would not be the shout of one man. It would be the chorus of many, each voice echoing the same eternal truth, that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. These early believers, few in number but mighty in faith, are the unsung heroes of the story. They carried the message in silence, nurtured it in secret, and bore its weight before it was ever met with glory. Their courage did not roar, it whispered. And in those whispers, history was changed forever. The time had come. The days of whispers were drawing to a close, and the quiet gatherings in secret corners of Mecca had fulfilled their sacred purpose. The foundation had been laid with care and devotion, hearts had been nurtured, and the early believers had grown strong in faith, despite the shadows that cloaked their gatherings. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, had carried the trust of divine revelation with grace and patience. But now, the command had arrived. The moment was no longer to be veiled in secrecy. Allah had instructed his messenger to rise and call publicly, to proclaim the truth without fear, and to let the light of Tawheed shine upon a people buried in darkness. It was no longer a private mission. The message was to awaken the city. With the weight of this command resting upon his noble shoulders, the prophet ascended the hill of Mount Safa, a place that had long served as a platform for announcements of importance in Meccan tradition. It was not an unfamiliar scene. Tribal elders had stood there before to rally people for trade or war, to settle disputes, to share news. But this time, the man who stood upon it came not with worldly plans or political schemes. He stood not for himself, but for his Lord. His message was not one of conquest, but of mercy, not one of division, but of unity. He had climbed that hill with a heart full of truth, trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the responsibility bestowed upon him by the Creator of the heavens and the earth. He called out, his voice steady and clear, "O people of Quraysh." His words pierced through the midday air, ringing through the streets of Mecca like the first drops of rain after a long drought. The people recognized his voice, and they came. Men and women, elders and youth, relatives and strangers, they gathered around the hill. For this was Muhammad al-Amin, the trustworthy one. He was not known for theatrics, nor had he ever cried wolf. His words had always been measured, his promises always kept. So when he called, they answered. They stood at the foot of Mount Safa, curious and attentive. What urgent matter could bring such a man to summon the people in this way? They looked up at him, waiting, and then he began to speak. Not with anger, not with pride, but with the solemnity of a man who carries the eternal on his tongue. "If I were to tell you," he said, "that there is an enemy approaching from behind this mountain, coming to attack you, would you believe me?" Without hesitation, the people responded, "Yes, we have never known you to lie." In that brief exchange, centuries of falsehood were exposed. For here stood a man whose truth had never been questioned, whose honesty was known to all. And yet when he followed those words with the divine call, when he said, "Then know that I am a warner to you," before a severe punishment, the mood shifted. When he called them to worship one God alone, to abandon their idols, to return to the path of their father Ibrahim, the air grew heavy. The silence that followed was not one of reverence, but of resistance. It was his own uncle, Abu Lahab, who broke the stillness, his voice laced with mockery and rage. "May you perish! Is this why you gathered us?" His words sliced through the gathering like a dagger. The very people who moments before had affirmed Muhammad's honesty now stood in discomfort. Truth, when it threatens comfort, is often rejected. And so began the open hostility, not just toward the message, but toward the man himself. The prophet descended from the mount with no applause, no celebration. But within his heart there was no regret. He had obeyed his Lord. He had fulfilled the command. The seed had been planted in the open earth, and though it would now face wind and storm, it would grow. Revelation continued to descend, verses filled with light and guidance, comforting his heart, strengthening his resolve. He had been commanded to rise and warn his people, and he did so with the dignity of a prophet and the compassion of a brother. The public call to Islam was not met with eager ears. It challenged everything Mecca stood upon, its idols, its hierarchy, its commerce, its pride. The prophet's words were simple: there is no God but Allah. But their meaning was profound. They called for justice, for humility, for accountability. They declared that stone could not hear nor help, that lineage alone was no measure of worth, and that every soul would one day stand alone before its creator. The Quraysh began to panic. This message was not just a matter of personal belief. It was a threat to their social structure. If the people abandoned the idols, the pilgrimage economy would collapse. If they accepted Muhammad's message, their tribal superiority would be questioned. And so, they responded not with curiosity, but with cruelty. They mocked him in the streets. They called him a sorcerer, a madman, a liar, even though moments before they had called him the most trustworthy. They offered him bribes, wealth, leadership, women, if only he would stop preaching. He refused not with bitterness, but with grace. "By Allah," he said, "if they place the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not leave this matter until Allah makes it victorious or I perish in its pursuit." It was not stubbornness, it was certainty. He knew what he carried, he knew its source, and he knew that the path would be hard. Yet still, he walked it. Not with armies, but with truth. Not with arrogance, but with mercy. He began to preach in the marketplaces, at the Kaaba, wherever hearts could be reached. The Quran, with its unmatched beauty and piercing wisdom, began to move through Mecca like a secret flame, warming some, burning others, and those who listened with sincerity began to change. Slowly, one soul at a time, the light spread. But so too did the hostility. Friends turned into enemies. Families were torn. The weak and the poor who believed were beaten and tortured. Yet the prophet never ceased. He prayed at night until his feet swelled. He continued to speak by day even when mocked. His mission was no longer quiet. It was now a fire in the heart of the city, a call that could not be silenced. Mount Safa remains to this day a silent witness to that first call. It stands not as a monument to pride, but as a reminder of a voice that rose alone, with nothing but truth in its heart. It reminds us that courage does not always come with crowds. Sometimes it begins with a single man on a hill, calling people back to their creator. And from that call, an entire world would one day echo his words, "La ilaha illa Allah. Muhammadur Rasulullah." The mountain watched him speak, the skies heard, and though many hearts turned away that day, the message did not stop. It had begun its journey from the heart of one man to the hearts of millions, carried through time, not by force but by love. A love for truth, for mercy, and for the one who sent him. Peace and blessings be upon the one who stood on Safa and began to change the world. When truth pierces through the veil of falsehood, it does not do so without resistance. It stirs the hearts of the sincere and unsettles the foundations of power built upon illusion. Such was the path of Islam in its earliest days. What began as a whisper in the night, as a message carried on the breath of sincerity, soon ignited a storm in the heart of Mecca. The call to worship one God, to abandon idols, to live justly and honorably, it was not a call to violence or rebellion. It was a call to return to the fitra, the natural state of the soul. Yet, it shook the city like an earthquake. For those in power, the message was not merely theology, it was threat. A threat to wealth, to pride, to tradition, and to control. The Quraysh could not deny the beauty of the Quran. Many who heard it for the first time were struck silent, their hearts moved by verses that seemed to know them better than they knew themselves. Even those who opposed it in public would confess in private that it was unlike anything they had ever heard. But rather than open their hearts, many of the leaders of Mecca allowed pride to harden them. They could not bear the thought that the final prophet had been chosen from among them, yet not from their elite circles. They could not accept that centuries of idolatry, customs, and inherited status would be cast aside by a man who stood before them with no army, no wealth, and no worldly power, only the truth of La ilaha illa Allah. And so, the storm began. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, became the target of growing hostility. They called him mad. They accused him of sorcery. They claimed he was possessed or seeking power. All of it, of course, was false, and they knew it. But falsehood, when desperate, will wear many masks to preserve itself. They tried to bribe him, offering him wealth, status, and even the hand of the most beautiful women, so long as he would stop preaching this one message. But he, with the dignity of a man who knew his mission came from above, responded with unwavering resolve. If they placed the sun in his right hand and the moon in his left, he would not abandon his call. When slander failed, the Quraysh turned to force. They could not attack Muhammad openly, for he still had the protection of his noble uncle Abu Talib. But they could, and did, turn their fury upon the weakest among the believers. And so began a chapter of pain and patience, of courage forged in the fires of oppression. Bilal ibn Rabah, a slave of Ethiopian descent, found himself at the mercy of his master's cruelty. His crime was believing in the oneness of Allah. For that, he was dragged through the streets, his body whipped and his skin torn. He was taken into the scorching desert, the blazing sun above him and the burning sand below. A massive stone was placed upon his chest, pressing the air from his lungs. And still, from his lips came only one cry, Ahad, Ahad, one, one. The torturers could not comprehend it. Why would a man endure such pain for a belief? But Bilal's heart had tasted freedom and faith. No chain could reach his soul now. His tormentors were bewildered, for they could crush his body, but not his spirit. Ammar ibn Yasir and his family faced trials that brought angels to tears. His father, Yasir, and his mother, Sumayya, were among the earliest Muslims. They were not of noble lineage, nor did they possess wealth. And so the Quraysh unleashed their full wrath upon them. Sumayya, aged and frail in body but unbreakable in spirit, was dragged through the streets and stabbed through the abdomen with a spear. She became the first martyr in Islam, her blood mixing with the dust of Mecca, a witness to her unwavering devotion. Yasir followed her shortly after. Ammar, forced to witness the horror, was beaten until he could barely breathe. In weakness and under torture, he uttered words to appease his tormentors, his heart in agony for what his lips had been forced to say. But the revelation descended to comfort him. His heart was firm in faith, and Allah knew it. Every day brought new wounds to the believers. Their homes were broken into. Their names were smeared. Their businesses were boycotted. Friendships were severed. Families disowned their own children. Those who had once walked freely through Mecca now moved in fear. They prayed in secret, gathered under cover of night, and whispered the Quran with trembling voices. But even in the shadows, their hearts burned with light. The Prophet himself bore the weight of this suffering. Though they did not yet dare to kill him, they did all they could to harm him. They threw filth on his back while he prostrated in prayer. They mocked him in public, ridiculed his words, and called him a mad poet. Once, while praying at the Kaaba, a mob attacked him so brutally that only the intervention of Abu Bakr saved his life. Abu Bakr himself was beaten so severely that his face became unrecognizable. Yet when he awoke from unconsciousness, his first question was not about his injuries. It was, "Is the messenger of Allah safe?" Such was the love the companions held for him. Their loyalty was not rooted in politics or gain. It was love born of knowing him, of tasting the truth through him, of seeing in his eyes the reflection of divine mercy. They saw him as the walking Quran, the embodiment of what it meant to live for something higher than this world. And he, in turn, loved them with a love so deep it could not be measured. He would pray for them through the night, tears falling from his eyes as he asked Allah to protect them, to strengthen them, to grant them Jannah for what they endured. He did not command them to fight or to retaliate. He taught them to be patient, to respond to cruelty with kindness, to trust in the promise of Allah. The revelations during this period did not call for revenge, they called for resilience. Verses came down that lifted their spirits, reminded them of the prophets before them, of the trials of Nuh, of Ibrahim, of Musa, and how truth always prevails, even if the road is long. The prophet would remind them that paradise was not won through ease. He would say, "There were those before you who were sawed in half, whose flesh was combed from their bones, yet they did not abandon their faith. By Allah, this religion will reach where the night and day reach, but you must remain firm." And they did. They remained firm. They held each other through grief. They nursed each other's wounds. They kept believing, even when the world around them called them mad. And though their numbers were small, their strength was immense. They were like stars in the night, scattered perhaps, but each one burning with divine purpose. These were the days that tested faith and proved hearts. These were the days that forged the core of the Ummah. Every act of patience, every drop of blood, every tear shed in prayer was recorded by the angels, written in the book of eternity. And from this crucible of pain, Islam emerged not as a religion of ease, but as a faith of depth, of conviction, of sacrifice for something greater than the self. Persecution did not silence them, it purified them, and their patience was not weakness, it was the echo of prophetic strength, the kind that shapes empires not with swords, but with hearts surrendered entirely to the will of the most merciful. Peace be upon them all, the first believers, the silent heroes, the courageous souls who carried the light through the darkness and paved the way for all who would one day utter with conviction, La ilaha illa Allah. The path of truth is never smooth, nor does it unfold without trial. For those who carry the light, the darkness often intensifies before it fades. And for the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and the growing yet vulnerable Muslim community in Mecca, the years that followed the public call to Islam brought some of the heaviest burdens they would ever bear. It was not just the sting of insults or the cruelty of beatings. It was the cold weight of isolation, hunger, and the grief of unbearable personal loss. But even within this storm there was still light. Light in their steadfastness, light in their trust in Allah, and light in their unwavering love for the Prophet who suffered with them, cried with them, and continued to pray for them long after the world turned its back. As the message of Islam began to spread and more hearts turned toward the truth, the Quraysh became desperate. Their pride would not allow them to admit that this man, this orphan, this man without soldiers or wealth was succeeding. They could not comprehend that it was not gold or swords that drew people to Muhammad, but the weight of his words, the gentleness of his heart, and the truth of his Lord. When mockery and torture failed, they sought something more ruthless. They decided not to attack with weapons, but with starvation. Not with war, but with abandonment. The leaders of the Quraysh gathered and signed a pact, a cruel agreement to cut off the Prophet and his entire clan, Banu Hashim. They would not trade with them, marry from among them, buy from them, or even speak to them. The scroll was hung inside the Kaaba, sealed with the pride of those who thought they could suffocate the light of Allah with parchment and ink. And thus began the boycott. The Prophet, his family, and his companions from Banu Hashim were forced into a valley on the outskirts of Mecca, known as the Valley of Abu Talib. It was a place of rocks and silence, far from the markets, far from mercy. The nights were cold, the days scorching, and the days turned into months, and the months into years, 3 long years. It was not merely exile, it was economic warfare. Food became scarce. Supplies trickled only through secret acts of kindness from a few noble hearts who defied the pact in secret, slipping sacks of grain in the dark of night, risking their own safety for the sake of justice. Inside the valley, hunger gnawed at the children, and the cries of the little ones broke the hearts of the men and women who could do nothing but pray and wait. The sound of their weeping would haunt the nights, and the Prophet, despite his own emptiness, would walk from tent to tent, offering comfort, whispering Quranic verses that reminded them of patience, of the trials of prophets past, of the promise of relief after hardship. His face, though pale from hunger, still glowed with faith. His voice, though tired, never failed to soothe, and his heart, though heavy with the burden of his people, never ceased to beat with love for them. The believers never turned away. They did not curse their fate, nor did they blame their prophet. If anything, they drew nearer to him. Their hunger was real, but their faith was deeper than their pain. They shared what little they had, supported one another, and held firmly to the rope of Allah. The Prophet continued to receive revelation, and these verses became their sustenance. The words of their Lord nourished their hearts when their bodies had nothing. It was in this valley, amidst the hardship, that their faith was polished like jewels under pressure. They were not just believers, they were survivors of the severest trial, purified by deprivation, yet elevated by trust. Outside the valley, the Quraysh grew restless. Some among them began to feel the pangs of conscience. The cruelty of the pact began to shame even those who did not believe in the message. One man, Hisham ibn Amr, could no longer bear the cries echoing from the valley. He, along with a few others, began to plot a way to end the boycott. They confronted the Quraysh leaders in the sacred sanctuary, appealing to their sense of honor. And finally, after 3 agonizing years, the pact was broken. When the Prophet and his people returned from the valley, they had lost weight, strength, and much of what little wealth they had possessed. But they had gained something far more powerful, a resilience that no worldly force could destroy. Their bodies were weakened, but their spirits had become unshakable. They had lived through isolation and starvation and emerged with their faith intact. The valley had tested their patience and they had passed. But the trials were not yet over. For just as they returned to Mecca, breathing the air of freedom once more, another deeper pain awaited the messenger of Allah. Within months, 2 of the most beloved pillars in his life would be taken from him. The first was Abu Talib, his uncle, his protector, his shelter against the fury of the Quraysh. Though Abu Talib had not accepted Islam, his loyalty to his nephew had never faltered. He defended the Prophet when no one else would, stood between him and danger time and time again, and bore the wrath of his tribe to preserve the life of the man he loved like a son. The Prophet sat at his deathbed, his heart breaking, knowing that the man who had shielded him for so long was now leaving. He pleaded with his uncle, begged him gently, "Say just one word, La ilaha illallah, and I will bear witness for you on the day of judgment." But Abu Talib, loyal to his people's customs and unwilling to defy his forefathers, passed away with those ancient words still upon his lips. The Prophet's eyes filled with tears, not of anger, but of sorrow. For though his uncle's protection had saved him from harm, the Prophet longed even more to see him saved in the hereafter. And as if the loss of Abu Talib was not enough, another blow followed soon after. His beloved wife, Khadijah, the first to believe, the first to comfort him, the mother of his children, the light of his home, she too passed away. She had grown weaker during the boycott, her health worn down by years of hardship and sacrifice. When she died, the Prophet lost more than a wife. He lost his closest friend, his confidant, his anchor. She had believed in him when the world denied him. She had lifted him when revelation overwhelmed him. Her love had been his refuge, her faith his strength. The grief that settled over the prophet was unlike anything before. His eyes shed tears, and his heart ached. These two losses, so close together, pierced him deeply. It was a year of sorrow, a year that carved a hollow in his chest that only Allah could fill. He would later call it al-Huzn, the year of sorrow. And yet, even in his grief, he did not falter. He turned to his Lord with even more devotion. The pain did not break him. It brought him closer to the one who never leaves, never dies, never forsakes. He walked the streets of Mecca now with no protector, no wife to soothe his heart, but with the Quran in his hands and the light of guidance in his soul. His enemies grew bolder, sensing his vulnerability, but he remained steadfast. For he knew what they did not, that the one who had sent him, the one who had carried him through every storm, was still with him. These trials were not punishments, they were preparation. They were the fire through which gold is purified. And through every loss, every tear, every pang of hunger, the prophet's resolve grew stronger. His love for his Lord deepened, his empathy for the weak expanded, and his message continued, unstoppable, eternal. The boycott and the year of sorrow were chapters of pain, yes, but they were also chapters of elevation. They were the crucible in which the early believers were molded into giants of faith. And they were a reminder to every generation that with hardship there is ease, that Allah never burdens a soul beyond what it can bear, and that the heart of a prophet, though tested again and again, always beats with patience, always hopes, always trusts. Peace and blessings be upon him, the one who endured it all for the sake of delivering light to us. The light that descended upon the heart of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was not a passing flame. It was a light meant to reach every corner of the earth, every crevice of the human soul. It was not bound by a moment in time, nor by the walls of Mecca or the sands of Arabia. This light was eternal, woven from the breath of divine mercy and shaped by the hands of the most merciful himself. It did not flicker when faced with hatred. It did not dim when wrapped in sorrow. It grew stronger, brighter, until the darkness that had long veiled humanity began to recede, one heart at a time, one soul at a time. The message that came to the prophet was simple in its words, but infinite in its meaning. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. In these few words rested the call to justice, to mercy, to freedom, to love, and to the oneness of all creation under one creator. The prophet carried this message with dignity and compassion, through hardship and joy, through rejection and reverence. He lived the message before he spoke it. He embodied it in every glance, every step, every silence. He was the Quran walking, a living testament to what it means to submit to Allah with one's entire being. This message did not merely invite people to change their beliefs. It called them to transform their lives. It asked them to cast away not just idols of stone, but the idols of ego, pride, greed, and cruelty. It reminded them that no race or class or title had weight before the eyes of God. The black and the white, the rich and the poor, the free and the enslaved, none held superiority except through piety, sincerity, and righteousness. This message was a healing, a liberation for hearts long shackled by fear, injustice, and emptiness. The prophet, peace be upon him, brought this message to life with a mercy that astonished even his enemies. He forgave when others expected revenge. He smiled when others would have cursed. He lifted the heads of the broken and sat with the forgotten. He defended the oppressed, honored the orphan, and raised the status of women in a society that buried its daughters. He taught that paradise lay beneath the feet of mothers. He taught that a smile was a form of charity. He taught that the best among people are those most beneficial to others. Every action of his was a reflection of the light he had been sent to deliver. His words were not empty. They were seeds planted deep in the soil of human conscience, and they bloomed not just in his lifetime but long after his body was placed in the earth. They reached lands he never walked, people he never saw. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Persia, from the rivers of Africa to the coasts of China, the message of Islam spread not merely through conquest or migration, but through the undeniable truth carried in the hearts of those who believed. The message touched poets and scholars, kings and servants, warriors and weavers. It reshaped empires, not through tyranny, but through the revolution of the heart. Yet, despite the enormity of the change, the prophet remained humble. He did not build palaces. He slept on straw mats. He mended his own clothes. He ate simply, shared generously, and wept for the salvation of people who had once thrown stones at him. He did not seek wealth or power. He sought only that people be guided, that they taste the sweetness of belief, that they know the one who created them with love. And when the victories came, when the people entered Islam in crowds, he did not raise his head in pride. He bowed it in gratitude. When he entered Mecca, not as an exile, but as a victor, he did not demand revenge. He offered forgiveness. He stood before those who had once plotted his death and said, "Go, for you are free." What kind of man does this? Only the one whose heart is fully surrendered to the most merciful. His final sermon was not a speech of self-glorification. It was a reminder that his mission was complete, that the trust had been delivered, and that now it was upon each person to carry it forward. He asked, "Have I conveyed the message?" And the crowd replied, "Yes, you have." He raised his finger to the sky and said, "O Allah, bear witness." These were not the words of a king. These were the words of a servant, a prophet, a man whose every breath had been for his Lord. Soon after, the verses ceased. Revelation was complete. The Quran was whole. The path had been laid. And not long after, the prophet fell ill. His final days were marked by weakness, but also by love. He prayed with his companions. He smiled through his pain, and he whispered words of peace. When he passed away, the sun seemed to dim, and the hearts of the believers trembled. How could the earth continue without him? How could the stars still shine? But the prophet had not left them with nothing. He had left them with the Quran, with his Sunnah, with a legacy so full of light that it would guide generations to come. He left behind a living faith, one that could be practiced in deserts and cities, in solitude and in society. He left behind a family of believers, an ummah, diverse in culture, yet united in creed. And his legacy lives on. Every time a person lifts their hands in prayer, every time a mother is honored, every time justice is upheld, every time a heart bows in humility to the one true God, his legacy breathes again. Every act of kindness, every drop of charity, every verse recited, every child taught to say, Bismillah, continues the light he brought. No one changed the world as he did. And yet, he changed it not with weapons, not with armies, but with love, truth, and patience. He changed it by changing hearts. And that is the miracle of his message. It does not need the approval of kings or the validation of scholars. It speaks directly to the soul. His name is now spoken in every language. His message is memorized by millions. His example is studied by hearts that beat centuries after his passing. His prayer is repeated across the globe, day and night, as his name is lifted in adhan after adhan, echoing through minarets, valleys, and cities. He was the lamp of guidance, the seal of the prophets, the mercy to the worlds. Peace and blessings be upon Muhammad, the man who walked in the darkness with a lantern in his hand and gave it to the world so we would never be lost again. As the journey of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, draws to its earthly close, one cannot help but pause and look back at the path he walked, a path illuminated not by the glow of wealth or the glory of worldly power, but by the divine light that radiated from his heart, his words, his every action. From the quiet cradle of his orphan childhood to the final breath he took in the embrace of his beloved Aisha, every moment of his life was a living verse, a testament to the nearness of Allah and the boundless beauty of submission to his will. His life was not a tale of ease. It was a story carved by hardship, polished by patience, and crowned by mercy. He knew the sting of loss, the loneliness of exile, the betrayal of those he once called kin. He carried the burden of a message that few wanted to hear, that many fought to silence. Yet through every trial, every tear, every stone thrown in hate, he responded with a patience that was not weakness, but strength beyond understanding. It was strength drawn from the well of divine trust, for he knew with certainty that his mission was not his own. It was entrusted to him by the Creator of the heavens and the earth. And what a mission it was, to remind a scattered humanity of its origin and its end. To call the arrogant to humility, the oppressor to justice, the wanderer to guidance. He did not come to build monuments or to carve his name into stone. He came to soften hearts, to lift the veils of ignorance, to cleanse the soul of its illusions. And through the revelation of the Quran, he gave the world a mirror, not of silver or glass, but of eternal truth. It is a mirror that shows us who we are and who we were created to be. In the depth of night, when others slept, he stood in prayer. His feet would swell, his eyes would weep, and still he would say, "Shall I not be a grateful servant?" He needed no audience. His soul yearned only for the gaze of his Lord. And though the weight of the world sat upon his shoulders, he never let the burdens of others go unattended. He listened when the weak came to him. He smiled at the young, stood for the elderly, and gave even when he himself had little. He forgave those who plotted his death. He prayed for those who hurled insults at him. He welcomed those who had once turned their backs. He was not just the final prophet. He was the mercy sent to all creation. He was the answered prayer of Ibrahim, the glad tidings of Isa, and the seal of a long chain of noble messengers. Through him, the covenant was completed. Through him, the message was preserved. Through him, Allah honored an entire nation and gave to the world a guidance that will never fade. And yet, for all the miracles he was given, his greatest miracle was his message, the Quran, living, breathing, unchanging. It speaks today as it spoke 14 centuries ago. It addresses kings and servants, scholars and shepherds, the weary and the awakened. In it, we find a voice that knows our fears, our hopes, our secrets. And behind that voice is the heart of the prophet, the heart that trembled in awe when the words first descended, the heart that bore the weight of revelation like a mountain, the heart that shattered when humanity turned away from truth and rejoiced when even one soul turned back. His legacy is not in the pages of history alone. It is in every hand raised in prayer, in every heart softened by remembrance, in every act of kindness done in his name. It is in the rhythm of the adhan that calls us to prayer, in the teachings passed from parent to child, in the comfort felt by those who read his words and know that they are not alone. His life was a lantern, and that lantern still burns. He did not leave us without a map. He left us his sunnah, his example, his path. And he reminded us that the true believer is the one who walks in his footsteps with sincerity, who lives not for the praise of people, but for the pleasure of the Most High. He taught us that Islam is not just a religion, it is a way of life. A way of walking, speaking, thinking, loving, forgiving, and returning. When the end of his life neared, he did not concern himself with his legacy or his worldly name. He was concerned for us, for his ummah. His last moments were filled with the remembrance of his Lord and concern for his people. Ummati, ummati, he whispered, even as his soul was preparing to meet its beloved. His final prayer was for us. His final wish was that we remain united, that we remain faithful, that we never abandon the light he left behind. And then he returned to his Lord, leaving behind a silence that echoed through the hearts of those who loved him. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with remembrance, with love, with purpose. The world had lost its greatest human being, but gained an eternal light. His body was buried, but his message rose higher than any mountain, deeper than any ocean, reaching across generations, lands, and languages. To love him is to follow him. To follow him is to serve Allah with sincerity. And to serve Allah with sincerity is to find peace, not only in this life, but in the life that follows. For the one who walks in the footsteps of the messenger walks not in darkness, but in light. They walk toward Jannah, toward the eternal gardens where the rivers flow beneath, and the face of the Prophet will once again be seen by those who truly loved him even without ever meeting him. The story of Muhammad, peace be upon him, is not just history. It is an invitation, a calling, a mirror, a mercy. It is a path back to our Creator, paved with his tears, his sacrifices, and his endless compassion. His journey changed the world, and it continues to change hearts every single day. May our hearts remain forever tethered to his. May our lives echo his gentleness, his strength, his patience, and his trust. And may we be among those who, on the day of judgment, are called by his voice, welcomed by his smile, and granted the shade of his intercession beneath the throne of the most merciful. Peace and blessings be upon him, the beloved of Allah, the mercy to mankind, the light of the world.